So my first example challenges the zero-sum game according to which the relative dominance of plants can only indicate the relative absence of humans, and vice versa, implied when Lewis and Maslin interpret the stratigraphic drop in CO2 levels as indicative of the reforestation that followed the genocide for Amerindians. The evidence offered in M. Pat Anderson's Tending the Wild, Native American Knowledge in the Management of California's Resources, to some extent confirms Lewis and Maslin's hypothesis. Prairies and meadows did give way to denser forests following the killing and forced removal of Californian Indians. But attention to Anderson's argument would also remind us that indigenous peoples were not simply swallowed by the forests that took their place, but that their relation to the ecological climax community was one of continued and reiterated delay and deferral, rather than simple opposition and negation. According to Anderson, the extraordinary diversity of and the micro differences found among California's wildflowers can be read as an expression and hence a persistence or survivance of disappeared Californian Indian practices, even if these practices themselves have for the most part fallen away. And here follows a quotation that's on the handout, and again, for those of you who may not be familiar with the definition of what a climax community is in evolutionary terms, I kind of stole it from Wikipedia. So this is Anderson. Many of the biologically richest of California's habitats were not climax communities at the time Euro-Americans arrived, but instead were a rich mosaic of ecological succession, or fire subclimaxes, intensified and perpetuated by seasonally scheduled burning. Heightened species diversity, abundance, and density have been associated with regular intermediate intensity, spatially heterogeneous disturbance. Based on this relationship, it can be hypothesized that the disturbance by California Indians' use of fire in a variety of ecosystems occurring at intermediate intensities and frequencies promoted a maximally heterogeneous mosaic of vegetation types and increased species diversity. Anderson invites us to read the work of Californian Indians in the pockets of wildflowers that remain, like outcroppings in the absence of the regularly timed disturbances that allowed them to take hold in the first place. The flowers we find today may be living beings, but they are also graveyards, museums, ruins, traces, forensic evidence of mass murder, as well as auto-representations of the pollinating practices that dilated time and that delayed the onset of climax communities. Discernible in the evidence through which Anderson sifts, in the oral narratives of survivors, as well as in the notes of European naturalists, is a formalization of time comparable to that of shepherds' calendars or farmers' almanacs. The sense that emerges is the organization of time into distinct intervals of off and on, overlapping cycles that extend sometimes 2 years or 3 or 5, seasons not partitioned according to the Earth's position relative to the sun, nor concluded within a single rotation around the sun, yet still in some kind of determinate relation to the work of photosynthesis performed within that period. And here again, I've included more passages than I have time to read, and I encourage you to read them on your own, because I think it's partly because this is elegiac work that's testifying to something that is for the most part disappeared. It's only through, I think, multiple excerpts that you can get a sense of what would have been a knowledge of extensive circular and repeatable time. So maybe just from the second, right, there were many more specific rules in California, such as take roots from one side of the tree only. When digging ponderosa pine roots for baskets, the Maidu cut roots from one side of the tree one year and one from the opposite side the next year, so as not to kill the tree. Anderson is inviting us to think about fire seasonality in a much richer and complex way than the way that we now think about it, which is simply that the fire season is when it's dry enough that there's fire danger. To manage here means to divert and fray what we now more or less ignorantly refer to as the single annual fire season by diversifying it into multiple seasons for different kinds of fire. In remembering that the frequent setting of such low-level fires would have prevented the kind of far more lethal top-crown forest fires so destructive to California's forests in recent years, there is cause to grieve in the way national forest policy continues to misrecognize this ecology. But there's also a chance to recover a seasonality that was less about living in accord with set periods of solar proximity and distance than of alternatively accentuating, minimizing, and pluralizing these fluctuations, disturbing and distributing their energies across time, and thereby deferring an otherwise violently destructive punctual event. In the same way, in protracting and extending the open spaces for wildflowers, thereby deferring the onset of what 20th century ecologists would call the forest climax community, the seed gathering and disseminating practices of California Indians compose a present that only appears unchanging, stable, or singular, a threading together of a series of successive prolongations of transient meadows.